Welcome to Colorado. How many of you are from Colorado? We finally got our own conference, right? We don't have to travel. Yeah, lived in Colorado all my life, so I'm happy to have this here. So today, Kirsty and I are going to be talking about the effects of the long tail of dwell time. You know, we hear about dwell time all the time. Oh, it's going down. How great. Pat yourself on the back. But what about the long tail? Because that's still a thing. So our data comes out of the M-Trends report. Hopefully you've seen the M-Trends report. It comes out of Mandiant, and what we do is we look at all of our investigations from the previous year and pull out our statistics. So that's where these data points are coming from that I'm going to share. And then I'm going to pass it over to Kirsty, and she's going to give you some use cases and examples. So this year, we saw that the global median dwell time was 10 days. Okay, again, pat yourselves on the back. We are actually getting better at what we do. Amazing. Ransomware is 5 days. So not surprising, ransomware threat actors are trying to make money, right? So they want to make money faster. We've even seen some threat groups that no longer deploy the ransomware and then encrypt everything. They're just deploying it, stealing a little bit of data, and saying, pay me now. So saves them time. And so that may be contributing to the 5 days that we're seeing. The other thing is that 54% of incidents are still reported, are still found by an outside group. Okay? So that could include Mandiant coming and telling you that you've been breached. It could include the ransomware developers saying, by the way, I breached you, here's a ransomware note. And so that counts in that external incident notifications. Unfortunately, I'd like to see that number go down. I'd like to say we're finding when we're breached ourselves, but we're not quite there yet. 52% of attacks are motivated by financial gain. So what else is there? So there's our nation-state attackers. There's espionage, not just from nation-state attackers. There's hacktivism. That makes up for the other pieces of that. We also found that exploits are the most common initial infection vector. So Carrie, why is it not phishing? Okay, we see in all the other reports, phishing is the number one. When Mandiant does our investigations, this is what we find with our data. This isn't a global survey of every breach that happened last year. So number one is exploits. Number two this year was actually phishing. Financial industry, most targeted, not too surprising there. Backdoors, most used malware category. So when are the attackers found? So dwell time being the time an attacker is in an environment before they are discovered by the organization or an outside organization. Again, pat ourselves on the back. We've been capturing this number for, is that 13 years? And it used to be over a year that they were in environments, median dwell time, that they were in environments before they were found. We are down now to 10 days. Significant improvement. Okay? Pat yourselves on the back. However, this is the catalyst for this presentation itself, is yes, dwell times are going down, but that's only part of the picture. So when we're looking at, oh, this is the past 6 years of data, we can see that, yes, here's the median. Obviously, it shows up well. We see some spikes around 150 days, 200 days, depending on the year. But you can see there's a pattern. For the last 6 years, there's been a pattern. And then there's a spike of the 1,000 days. You're getting into 5 years that we're finding adversaries in organizations before they're identified. So what about that? I mean, that's more than 50% of the investigations that we've looked at. So that's what we want to figure out. When I first came into this and we were talking with Kirsty, and I said, well, the 5 days, the 10 days, that must all be ransomware. Give me my money. And then when you're talking about the 5-year stuff, that must be espionage, that must be nation states. And that is not always the case. So she's going to talk about the distribution of that. And I'll pass it over to you for the case studies.
Ah, perfect. All right, so diving into the juicy stuff, right? Maybe? There we go. Okay, so to really paint this picture, we have to go way back in time to our favorite Stuxnet, right? This is the first known in the wild cyber attack, right? And Stuxnet is generally considered to be the first to demonstrate that networked cybersecurity physical systems could be remotely leveraged to cause significant real-world threats, right? Real-world impacts. This realization, coupled with the incredible sophistication of the Stuxnet malware, have been found or have informed in our attackers and our defenders on how they thought about connecting these systems into an environment, right? And so for those of you that may not be as familiar with Stuxnet as I am, Stuxnet targeted nuclear facilities in Iran to sabotage the uranium enrichment process, right? The malware took control of the programmable logic controllers, or the PLCs, to manipulate the centrifuges, and Stuxnet caused physical damage to those centrifuges by operating their rotator speeds. So let's look at the timeline in context of dwell time, right? So in the spring of 2010, a Belarusian firm discovered this virus, but it wasn't until July of the same year when the connection was made between the plaintext reference in the malware to a human-readable, or to the human-machine interface, or the HMI, that is used by the industrial control systems, right? That analyst shared some of their thoughts on a malware discussion forum, and in-depth research then later began, right? In fact, Langner and Symantec conducted intensive and extensive reverse engineering and investigative services to dive in and figure out how Stuxnet operated, what it did, and what the impact was between August 2010 and then later over to November 2013. So then we look at other open source intelligence reports, and we see that many reports have actually placed the initial usage of the Stuxnet malware back to 2007. So this means that it took nearly 3 years before this malware was ever discovered and any problem was identified, right? Moreover, it validated that operational technology was an attack vector that proved essentially that security through obscurity and that air-gapped nature of those networks was not something that would prevent these attacks, right? These previously foreign and seemingly isolated systems were now potential targets for nation-state actors, as well as unaffiliated actors. And now, I know what you're thinking. Kirsty, this was nearly 2 decades ago when this was all populating. Surely we've gotten better. You would be correct in that it is old, but let's look at some recent examples. APT29 and the Sunburst malware. FireEye Mandiant discovered the supply chain attack that Trojanized the SolarWinds Orion business software update. And that Trojanization essentially distributed malware that we call Sunburst. The sophistication and the patience of this threat actor that conducted this operation, along with the way that the malware was used, provided this operation with a long tail dwell time. And a general overview of this, because this is not an APT29 briefing, we attribute this to a Russia-based espionage actor assessed to be sponsored by the Russia Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, which Mandiant calls APT29. This operation afforded APT29 with unparalleled access to an estimated of 18,000 global organizations for follow-on targeting based on the attacker's decision and collection priorities. This operation had a multi-staged process, right? It began with the targeting of SolarWinds to implant this backdoor into the Orion tool. Then the attackers gained access to those 18,000 targets through that Trojanized binary that was deployed via the software update. And then they successfully targeted the data based off of the profiling of the compromised systems that were coming back to them. This backdoor that was used, Sunburst, was designed to stay dormant for up to 2 weeks before it retrieved and executed commands masquerading as the Orion business software update tool. So this software supply chain attack was in the wild, and no one really knew about it. So let's look at this timeline for the supply chain attack in the context of dwell time, right? So at the time of the disclosure, it was believed that this campaign may have began as early as spring 2020, right? Mandiant notified the public of this global intrusion on December 13th, 2020, which was about 9 months. And then later, SolarWinds identified that the earliest evidence of compromise for them was September 2019, which pushed it back a little bit further, about 15 months. So when we look at something that is an ongoing investigation, right, when we're talking about dwell time in the context of an M-Trends report, we're looking at individual investigations and how that stacks up against us. But until how that stacks up against our customers, right? But when we're looking at how we're using dwell time in the context of using it from the report to your boardroom and explaining things, we have to also take into consideration what that landscape looks like. So since 2020, Mandiant has discovered that there's an increase in these financially motivated threat actors, especially after this highlighted espionage-related operation by APT29 happened. These financially motivated threat actors began targeting software supply chains to conduct these operations, right? These threat actors compromise popular software packages and even mobile applications in order to deploy their ransomware. They deploy their cryptocurrency miners and even baking Trojans. Software supply chains, while they are on the more sophisticated side of the initial intrusion vector, it affords threat actors with seemingly unfettered access into these organizations, into their targets' environments, and often it allows them longer periods of dwell time in that environment because they're operating as, potentially an IT admin or something where they're living off the land, where normal and like what we believe or what we have grown to know, the EDR or the endpoint detection and response tooling to look for malware signatures or something like that is not catching that abuse of privilege. So let's dive into a more widespread, long-standing malicious access, right? Because Stuxnet, APT29, and Sunburst don't generally impact most people in this room, right? So virtually every, virtually every industry is impacted by some type of malware distribution group. Oftentimes, the most publicity falls on those sophisticated actors like I spoke about before, that they have all of these new and cool tricks and all of these cool techniques, and that is just resulting in an interesting story that is being told. But the groups that maintain these malware distribution operations rely on the simplicity. So sometimes that's also all that's needed, right? These groups have worked to establish themselves in the cybercrime space with two main goals. Gaining initial access to those targeted systems. This could be through various techniques such as phishing emails, exploit kits, or imitating legitimate software, right? Then they're looking to deliver and deploy their malware. Once the access is gained, these groups are responsible for deploying the initial malware payload, right? This could range from information stealers all the way to backdoors that are further used for exploitation. So a few key observations from the front line in my experience on these types of intrusions is that these groups often collaborate with other threat groups. What's interesting about that is, like we were talking about in the keynote and the ransomware panel earlier, just like 20 minutes ago, we have to look at the full scope, the full ecosystem of what's happening in the ransomware underground, right? Since these groups are collaborating together, the malware distribution groups are often working in conjunction with other specialized groups, like those ransomware actors, and even we're seeing espionage actors as well. They may provide initial access for a fee or a share of profit, right, for those successful attacks. When we're looking at one environment, we may look at multiple threat clusters of activity within that environment, but the entirety of that investigation we look at as an entire dwell time, right? When was the initial access for that caused the issue? When was that provided to the threat actor? Next, of course, we are looking at the use of these multiple malware distribution groups to further the motivations of these threat actors, right? Financially motivated groups are often the ones that you hear about utilizing these malware distribution groups. But Mandiant also is tracking a number of state-sponsored groups that use similar tactics for espionage-related and disruptive purposes. So we want to keep our eye out for those as well, especially if you're in one of those industries that type of disruption or an espionage-related action would cause a huge impact for you. We also look at this separation that allows them to constantly evolve, right? Because the malware distribution groups are operating separately and they are maintaining their own code base, they're looking at things that are happening within the security world, right? To constantly adapt their tactics, techniques, and procedures, or their TTPs, to evade detection and increase the success rate for their operations, right? So malware groups can be tricky when we're talking about that, or malware distribution groups can be tricky when we're talking about them at scale, right? So let's narrow it down to some of my least favorites. Okay, Emotet, ICE-ID, TrickBot, oh my. It's no surprise, oh, spoiled it. It's no surprise that we could all hear the collective sigh of all of the SOC analysts around the world at that moment, right? These banking Trojans turned into multifaceted backdoors really have done a number on them. Let's take a look at some basic timelines, and for simplicity's sake, I'll refer to these malware families as such instead of diving into the UNC naming conventions that we use at Mandiant to track them, just to make it a little bit easier to follow. So, Emotet was first discovered in 2014 by Trend Micro, highlighting that malware was targeting banking credentials using a man-in-the-middle type technique. And back then, the malware was viewed as spammy, just like Kimberly was talking about in the roundtable, because of the mail distribution vector, right? These phishing emails were disguised as banking notifications, and they had malicious attachments or links in them that tricked the user into logging into their banking platform. Over time, the developers of the Emotet malware built in more capabilities. Modification for the malware to collect email addresses, to further spam and distribute their malware across their targets seemingly without any interaction by any human body. Also, they implemented a secure command and control communication that really hadn't been seen before, the revolutionary concept of HTTPS. And even new ways to distribute the malware, right? They were using seemingly rudimentary exploit kits to infect web surfing victims by a drive-by download. So think about malicious ads or an infected iframe on a website. Then, in 2017, the IBM X-Force team notified the industry that Emotet was being used to distribute another banking Trojan, ICE-ID. The same narrative plays out with ICE-ID, and the developers continued over time to build in different capabilities for that malware to continue to spread into environments that it was released in. Again, identified as something spammy or something that was not really worth the time of pulling up your IR retainer and calling in Mandiant or CrowdStrike or even IBM X-Force, right? We were seeing this all through telemetry, and we're seeing this through network signatures across third-party vendors, right? So moving further in time, Emotet then began delivering TrickBot payloads. which ultimately opened the door for ransomware actors to start deploying different variants like Ryuk. And Ryuk was done in a very fast-paced manner. So when we look at the overall usage of these malware frameworks, what makes them so successful is what makes them so successful in maintaining access to environments for long periods of time is that they worm through environments, right? If you miss one system within your organization, you are opening yourselves up to a reinfection, unfortunately. This is why it's so important to have an IR retainer, to have them come in and sweep your entire environment. If you cannot, just blank slate, reimage every single system in your environment. So what, right? Like, so what? Everyone has heard about these malware distribution groups, these prolific malware baking Trojans. It's hard to pin down a specific dwell time for each individual group because it's a collection of threats. We are looking at an ecosystem that kind of ebbs and flows and uses each other whenever it's convenient for them. It's important to challenge your thinking here. When a phishing email comes in and it delivers a malware payload successfully, do you and your team know enough about your physical and cloud environment to call your environment secure once you've swept it, right? Having done an initial triage of that phishing email, do you know the full extent of what that phishing email is capable of doing within your environment? Did that payload have the ability to worm its way through the environment? Did it have the capability to collect passwords of the users on the host that were logged in at the time? Did it replicate itself into other paths within the file system that you may not know about from the initial triage of the payload? Because it's really, it's either encrypted or something like that. These are all questions that need to be answered before we give the all clear for everyone to come back up, right? And oftentimes, one of the challenges with an IR team working with an organization that has been impacted with something like this, that is a challenging risk to communicate to a board, right? Is that we could potentially get reinfected, which increases a lot, right? So for the last case study, I want to highlight widespread vulnerabilities. Specifically, we'll look at Log4j as an example. I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of Log4j. Give me a hand if you have. Yep, that's what I thought. The Log4j vulnerability was highly critical due to the widespread nature of Log4j in every technology, it seemed. And the ease of exploitation as well increased the criticality. The initial vulnerability allowed for remote code execution, enabling attackers to take control of affected systems. Subsequent vulnerabilities further compounded that issue, requiring multiple patches and updates, right? This, coupled with the challenge of finding all of the systems that were impacted at first, and then also making sure that those systems could be updated, was the biggest challenge that we're still seeing today, right? It's crucial for organizations to ensure that systems are having some type of patch management or some type of vigilancy when we're talking about these systems that cannot be patched. Is there a way that we can pull those systems off of the network and isolate them in a way that does not interrupt business operations or move something to another side of the environment that lessens the impact that these widespread vulnerabilities, specifically Log4j, has on an environment? Because these threat actors of all motivations tend to take advantage of these types of widespread vulnerabilities. We've heard this. It's been kind of everyone's life for the past, I think, 3 years. Mandiant specifically continues to see these adversary leverage exploits to initiate continuing investigations, right? What we like to call double tap. They'll come back and they'll try to knock again to see if the patch actually took, right? Perimeter devices, like we were talking about again in the keynote, are accessible via the internet. by nature, right? And virtualized solutions as well, something that was heavily impacted by the Log4j vulnerability, as well as those virtual private networks or VPN devices, remain highly sought after for targets, or highly sought after targets for these attackers. And a lot of times, organizations that I've worked with in my incident response days don't have a plan to take those systems offline, and they don't have a way to, kind of mitigate the risk of keeping it up. But they also generally don't have a way of identifying malicious access coming through, because perimeter devices tend to not get fed into a SIM, right? Because who needs to look at security tools, right? No one needs to look at security tools. So anyway, before I jump on that soapbox, let's look at the Log4j vulnerability timeline to kind of just make sure that it's fresh in everyone's mind, of course. I don't know how you could forget it. But in late 2021, Apache was made aware of the Log4j vulnerability, and the developers moved to release some patches. Early 2022, however, saw Log4j vulnerability continue to be heavily exploited. It was actually quite interesting to see the volume of attacks that were happening through third-party telemetry, even outside of Mandiant-specific engagements. Government agencies and security organizations issued urgent warnings. I'm pretty sure that it hit CNN, and I'm pretty sure that my grandmother called me, and that was a fun conversation. But what we're looking at here is that we saw these organizations trying to convey to the public, directly to the public, that this is an ongoing issue, something we haven't really seen a lot in the past, right? And then throughout 2022 and beyond, despite the patches being available, many systems still remain vulnerable to the widespread use of the Log4j exploits because of the difficulty in finding the systems that are impacted, as well as the difficulty in patching something like an embedded system, right? This further highlights the reminder of knowing your environment and knowing what's supposed to work, right? And understanding how these vulnerabilities and these vulnerable systems specifically are utilized within your organization and in the environment. What is the level of effort to remove those systems from your environment and maybe replace them or potentially take them offline until you can patch them? So as of 2024, now, Log4Shell remains to be a significant threat to most organizations. We see scanning constantly for it, which is highlighting that, further highlighting the importance of an ongoing and vigilance patching effort or patching program within your environment. These widespread vulnerabilities continue to provide significant access to threat actors, right? And it's of all motivations. This in turn, with complicating patching efforts like for Log4j and other security black box assets like a perimeter device, perhaps, limits the ability to patch directly, right? And that is causing a number of unhelpful feelings when we are trying to get to the bottom of how things are going. Is we have to pull that system offline. No, we can't do that because that's the only way our remote staff can get in. And having those conversations play out in, let's say, a tabletop, again, like we were talking about in the keynote. I swear Kevin stole all of my lines. We have to make sure that the defenders across the globe and across all industries are taking this into consideration, because one thing that we want to make sure to help lessen the long tail dwell time is that visibility component, right? So lessons learned. Dwell time is continuing to go down, right? But those long tails are still happening, and they're going to continue to happen until we have a solid understanding of what our environment looks like and have full visibility in our environment. There's going to be some things that, come up always, like the APT29 operation with Sunburst. Those things those will always happen, unfortunately. These attackers are getting better, and like John Holquist was talking about with Volt Typhoon, they're doing things in a way that they are evading the security technology that we have in place at this time, right? But we can get better too. You have anything to add?
Nope.
Perfect.
Carry on.
Many motivations are also observed across all of these long-tail dwell times. Like Harry mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, you would think that ransomware is at the beginning of that dwell time diagram, but sometimes we have long-tail actions where, perhaps this organization is at the very bottom of the ransomware operator's target list, right? And they've had TrickBot or some other type of malware distribution or some other type of drive-by malware in their environment that has provided access into their environment for six months to a year, right? And then we see these ransomware operators come in and within 5 days, they're deploying ransomware.
And that actually could be part of the, distributing the malware, getting inside of a system and waiting until you have a buyer to pass off that access to. It also could be that you send it out into the wild. It infects so many machines that now you don't have time to deal with it all. And so that could also cause the time. The other thing is that we do see threat actors that evolve. So there was one, I believe it was last year. It was kind of attributed to teenagers. And you could kind of see their, first they just wanted to see if they could get in. They were asking for $50,000 in ransom or a PlayStation. You're like, what is happening here? But you kind of could see them evolve and work with, I think, more business-minded people and kind of change their tactics and how they're going to get in and what they're going to do.
Yep, exactly. And I wish I could tell you that the next slide would give you here's how you limit your dwell time, blah, blah. Unfortunately, that's not the case. No, there's no one-size-fits-all mitigations. And I'll go out on a limb and say if someone tells you that there is a one-size-fits-all, they're probably lying to you. And that's probably the biggest takeaway that I want to tell everyone here. But things that you can do today, walking out of this room, no matter what organization you are operating within, what your role in that company is, user privileged assessments, right? We want to make sure that users are not operating as domain admin ever, ideally, because what that does is allows an attacker access, especially if you're in a Windows environment and those credentials are cached somewhere. You sometimes don't know how long they're cached for. It's a fun tabletop question to ask. We also want to look at critical log assessments, making sure that you see everything that's happening. North, south, east, west. We want to make sure you have it all. We want to make sure you have a visibility into your cloud environment. What are those cloud users doing? Where's the data going? Right? If we have cloud assets, who has access to it?
And I have some additions to that.
Yeah.
In cybersecurity, we always say, we need visibility, we need visibility, we need visibility. We buy new tools, we add more stuff to a SIM that then the analyst is possibly overwhelmed, or we add in information that the analyst doesn't know how to catch and do something with. So just because you buy a technology, you also need to make sure that somebody's there to catch that information and knows what to do with it, or else you've just made a poor investment and maybe you could have put that money someplace else. The other thing is that user privilege assessments, along with critical log assessments, are extremely important in the cloud. So as more and more are adopting this, there's tools built into clouds themselves that can monitor this for you. But user privilege assessment and access is going to be one of the most important things going forward. I was going to say one more very important thing about log assessments, but
make sure that you're logging the right logs and not I don't know, silly logs that are blowing up your network stack and using up all of your storage. I've seen that happen too. It's really fun.
Well, I remember what I was going to say is that the other thing is a lot of times you only store logs for 30 days. So if you're trying to do the third thing, you're not going to be able to. If you have an attacker that's been in your environment for 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, and you have zero evidence of what happened 3 years ago, you're in trouble. Now, that is going to be storage costs. There's going to be a price to pay for that, but find the medium for you. But 30 days ain't it. I'm just telling you. You need more than 30 days.
Yeah. Threat hunting, everyone's favorite. And I think threat hunting has turned into a lot of things, right? What I think I'm speaking of specifically is taking, you hear about an emerging threat that's happening. You read something coming out from CrowdStrike, Mandiant, Google Cloud, that an ongoing attack is happening. You hear from one of your providers that they have been notified of something that's happening, on one of your business provider side. Take those indicators, go into your environment and see if you can find something similar, right? It doesn't have to be malicious, but see if you can see what they're seeing, right? If they say, give your SOC a quiz of like, hey, can we see how many domain admins are logged in at this time? Good luck, because unless I'm asking the MD kids, like I generally know that that's a question that I get like wait, what? So go and look for the holes in your environment. Go and look for the things that you don't know about, right? Hey, we just put in this network, this piece of network technology, and I'm not seeing any type of logs coming from it, and I want to know why. And is that because the vendor didn't set it up? Is that because we didn't turn on that we have a Splunk instance and it's like still getting indexed? Or is it because these systems just don't talk to each other and there's not a data profile set up yet? That is something that you can do today, leaving this room, and be like, hey, do we have this, right?
The other thing I'd say about threat hunting is, it takes people, it takes time. So if you're lucky enough to have a whole team of threat hunters, congratulations. When you don't, perform a threat hunt and then supplement it with technology that can do these kind of continuous assessments until you can do that again. I would say the same thing with cloud is, do red team engagements and then find the technology that's going to continually do that so that every workload you're adding to a cloud is going to be, run through the ringer, and then continually do the human-led threat hunting red teaming itself. But there is technology to be able to help you kind of maintain in between those moments. And especially when you're adding new things to the cloud, new workloads, extremely important. Another thing that we see a lot is M&A. So you just bought a company and inherited a whole bunch of baloney.
Whole bunch of systems.
Right, and then you realize they don't have the logs. Even if you had your stuff in order, they may not. And so that's where, you may not even have your logs at least 30 days. But that's where threat hunting is really going to help out as well.
Cool. All right. Maybe I can cut a little bit early, unless there are burning questions. But there is lunch waiting for us, and we could be at the first in line. So I'll give it a second. But that's all we got for you. Any questions? Oh, I think we have a microphone coming. I think the audio is being recorded, so.
Yeah, you shared a lot on how the dwell time analysis you did. With one view was the APT actors, the other view was vulnerabilities. Did you tie them ever together? Is there a pattern in types of vulnerabilities that help people have longer dwell time? Instead of just looking at the actors, just the types of vulnerabilities that actually enable longer dwell time. You gave one log4j example. Do you have other examples of just purely looking at the technical vulnerability stack that actually enables longer dwell time?
Yeah, we generally don't paint that picture in a report like mTrends, just because it's a smaller data set, it's not speaking for the whole environment or whatever. We can look at, I think, a more interesting metric to measure, as opposed to like this vulnerability has a long tail dwell time in an environment, right? Is looking at the time to patch, right? So between the exploit being identified, the proof of concept being released, and then the proof of concept code being released to the mass scanners to start doing the widespread visibility, and then the patch being released by the vendor that has put out this, this technology. All of those are very interesting to look at, especially when we're looking at, hey, what is our time to patch internally? Does it have to go through a fiscal quarter of testing to make sure that it's not impacting anything in our test environment before we push it to prod? Is that, like, do we have an escalation path that covers the dwell time? I guess we can call it a dwell time, it's not really a dwell time, but the time to patch we're seeing for these critical vulnerabilities, right? Because when we're looking at the software side, it's a little bit easier to patch those things, right? Theoretically, right? But when we're looking at the time to patch and implementing that patch for something like an edge device, that might be a little bit harder because that involves a lot of work with the vendor. That involves a lot of work for your networking team. And then it also involves probably looking at how do we do an investigation of this black box that we have no idea how to access, we have no idea how to get data from, and now we're relying on the vendor, right? So is there a plan in place for that? As opposed to looking at like, oh yeah, like Log4j is still being targeted, right? The better question, I think, personally, as someone who doesn't control any of this, but the better question is what is our time to patch internally to help avoid this? Because we can see, everyone's going to keep scanning everything. We still see like MS08 critical vulnerabilities in like Windows 7 being scanned for, right? And you'll be surprised. I still see it in investigations. It's sad. But the time to patch there is like kind of sad because now we're on like what, Windows 12 or something, right? We should be past this, but we're not. Why is that? Why are we not past it? Is it because we're running in tech debt, or do we have a limited capability of bringing in tools and technologies that are business critical that rely on this older technology, or what's happening there? So I think it's cool to look at the dwell time for these other vulnerabilities, but I think it's even better to ask, what's the time to patch for this for that vulnerability, but then what's our time to patch and can we match it? Does that make sense?
Another piece about that is that once you get to dwell time, that's just finding the attacker.
Right.
You still have the whole remediation piece to go through. So how do you shrink that? Because if you haven't practiced it, if you haven't documented, if you don't know how to talk to your supplier, if you don't know how to, get in front of the developers and get a patch in quick,
right,
that's going to affect the impact to your entire business. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't stop at dwell time.
Cool. Anyone else?
Making Marcus run.
Sorry.
Okay.
Hey, you had a statement about log retention and how log retention basically would depend on, say, how much you have to spend, where you're going to store it, regulations, whatever it is. So with the companies that do report the breaches and the dwell time, if there's no logs to see the dwell time, how does that get reported or recorded in the statistics?
Great question. So the company is not reporting dwell time. The investigators are reporting the dwell time. So it's the first identified instance of an attacker within your environment, right? So we look at when they were notified. So let's say, they get a call from CISA and they say, hey, we see, or the FBI calls on and say, hey, we see some like Fin6 activity in your environment. You should probably go look at that. They call Mandiant. And Mandiant goes in. We note down that they got notified at this time by the FBI. Cool, external notification. Perfect. They do an investigation and they start finding things. A lot of times, you will be surprised what we can find through a forensics review, right? Whether it's on the system themselves or it's on, in a backup, because a lot of times you'll be able to see, especially for these long-tail actors like a Fin6 investigation, they've been in the environment for a while and they're looking to scrape a bunch of stuff out, right? So you'll be able to gain a lot of information, but it's a lot easier and it's a lot quicker when we're talking about impacts and when we're talking about the full scope of the investigation. It's a lot easier when there's the logs, right, available. Not only is it a lot easier for us to detect and like calculate the dwell time, but it's a lot easier for us to work with lawyers and regulators to say this is what has been accessed. Because if you don't have logs, everything was accessed. But if we can tell you what was accessed, then we can help you maintain the relationship with your customers or your organization to say, like, this is the impact of what's happening. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thanks.
Perfect. Yeah.
We're getting kicked off stage. So thank you all. Enjoy your lunch.